first time my new neighbor told me my grandfather's fence was ugly, she was standing in my driveway like she'd come to repossess the house. 3 weeks later, she had the HOA fine me for it, the county inspect it, and half the neighborhood whispering that my family had become a problem. What she did not know was that the fence she wanted gone was sitting 3 feet inside my property line, and behind it I had enough limestone to build something she would be staring at for the rest of her life. My name is Wade Mercer. I was 47 when all this happened, and until then I had never thought of myself as a man who held grudges. I ran Mercer Ridge Stoneworks outside a little Colorado town called Bellwether, where the foothills turn purple at sunset, and everybody claims they moved there for peace and quiet. Right up until they hear a tractor before breakfast. My grandfather bought our land in 1979, back when the road was gravel. The nearest grocery store was 20 miles away, and nobody used phrases like architectural harmony. He built our house himself, cut the foundation stone from the ridge behind it, and put up a cedar fence along the eastern pasture in 1984. That fence was not fancy. It leaned a little where the winter wind came off the mountain. The boards had gone silver with age, and one post had a knot shaped like a rabbit if you looked at it from the right angle. But every post was sunk deep. Every joint was pegged by hand, and it had survived 4 decades of snow, drought, elk, hail, and my father backing a hay wagon into it twice. Grandpa used to slap one of those posts and say, "Wade, pretty things get replaced, solid things get inherited." I believed him. Then Marlene Voss moved in next door. She was 60, recently retired from running a private middle school in Denver, and she had the posture of someone who had spent 30 years waiting for people to stop talking. Her house was one of those oversized modern farmhouses built by people who think painting something white makes it rural. Black windows, decorative beams, a porch no one ever sat on, and landscaping that needed more water than our entire south pasture. She drove a pearl-colored SUV, wore spotless walking shoes, and joined the Cedar Crest HOA board before the moving boxes had left her garage. At first I tried to be friendly. I took over a loaf of my sister's sourdough, introduced myself, told her where the well shutoff was in case the pipes froze. She looked past me toward the quarry and asked, "Is that equipment always going to be visible?" I laughed because I thought she was joking. She did not laugh. A few mornings later, I noticed her walking the property line with her phone held chest high, taking pictures of my loader, my work truck, the woodpile, even the rusted bell my grandmother used to ring when supper was ready. She called them neighborhood walks. My old neighbor Ruth Ellison called them evidence gathering. Ruth was 82, lived 2 houses down, and had the kind of hearing that failed during polite conversation, but worked perfectly through closed windows. She stopped me at the mailbox one afternoon and said, "That new woman asked how long your fence has been falling apart." I said, "It is not falling apart." Ruth nodded. "I know that." She does not care. The confrontation came on a Saturday morning while I was greasing the hinges on my equipment shed. Marlene walked straight up my driveway, stopped 10 feet from me, folded her arms, and stared out the fence like it had insulted her family. "That old thing has to go," she said. I wiped my hands on a rag. "Morning to you too. It is lowering the appearance of the entire lane. I have had 2 people mention it already." I asked who. She smiled. "That is not important. What matters is that we maintain standards." I told her my grandfather had built it by hand before Cedar Crest existed, before her house existed, before anybody around there had heard the word HOA. She tilted her head and gave me this small, patient smile, the kind teachers use when a child gives the wrong answer with confidence. "Wade, history is not an excuse for neglect." I said, "It is not neglected. It is weathered. There is a difference." She stepped closer, tapped one cedar rail with a manicured finger, and said, "Time moves on. You should too." Then she looked me right in the eyes and added, "Your grandfather is not here to be offended anymore." I do not know how to explain what that did to me. Anger would be the easy word, but it was quieter than anger, colder. I could suddenly remember Grandpa's hands, split at the knuckles, smelling like cedar shavings and coffee, guiding mine around a hand plane when I was 8 years old. I remembered standing beside him in that same pasture while he measured each post twice and made me check the line with string. Marlene had lived beside me for 21 days and somehow believed she had the right to dismiss 40 years of my family's life in one sentence. I looked at her and said, "You should head home now. She gave me a little laugh, like I had confirmed some private opinion, then turned and walked back across the gravel. 3 days later, the certified letter arrived. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and stamped Cedar Crest Community Association in dark green ink. Inside was a violation notice citing Section 9.4, Visual Deterioration of Boundary Structures, along with a $50 fine and an order to replace the fence within 30 days using approved composite panels in either sandstone beige or heritage gray. I stood in my kitchen reading that phrase while looking through the window at actual 40-year-old cedar, and I nearly laughed. Then I reached the signature line. Complaint submitted by Marlene Voss, board member, Neighborhood Appearance Committee. She had been there less than a month and had already invented a committee for herself. I called the HOA office and asked for the president, a man named Carl Danner, who sounded exhausted before I finished introducing myself. He said they had received photographic documentation and were required to act. I asked whether anyone had inspected the fence. He paused. Not yet. I asked whether anyone had checked when it was built. Another pause. He said, "We can discuss that at the next meeting." That was when I understood the system Marlene was using. She did not need to prove anything. She only needed to create enough paper that everyone else became tired before she did. 2 days later, she raised the stakes. A white county truck pulled into my driveway just after 7 in the morning. The inspector, a woman named Denise Harper, climbed out holding a clipboard and said someone had reported a dangerous structure at risk of collapse. Across the property line, Marlene stood on her back patio with a coffee mug in both hands, watching. Denise spent half an hour checking every post, pushing against the rails, measuring the lean, and digging around the base with a steel probe. Finally, she straightened up and said, "Whoever built this did not believe in minimum requirements. These posts are deeper than half the new fences I inspect." I asked if it was unsafe. She snorted. "This fence will still be here after both of us are gone." Marlene's patio door slammed so hard I heard it from 60 yards away. Denise started filling out her report, then glanced toward the limestone ridge behind my workshop. "You still zoned agriculture on this parcel?" she asked. I told her yes. The quarry and pasture rights had never changed. She nodded slowly. "Then you have more options than your neighbor probably realizes. Livestock barriers can go up to 8 feet without design approval, as long as they are fully inside your line." I looked at the old fence, then at Marlene's wall of windows facing my land. For the first time since she moved in, I smiled, not because I had a plan yet, but because somewhere in that one sentence, I could feel one beginning. I did not tell Denise what I was thinking, mostly because I was not entirely sure myself. But that afternoon, I went up into the attic and started digging through the metal filing cabinet my father had refused to throw away. The drawers smelled like dust, machine oil, and the cedar blocks my grandmother used to keep moths out of old blankets. My family had saved everything: tax receipts, quarry permits, livestock records, even handwritten invoices from customers who paid in cash and eggs back in the 80s. Near the bottom of the second drawer, I found a rolled survey tied with a faded blue ribbon, dated May of 1983. I spread it across the kitchen table and held the corners down with coffee mugs, and stared at the eastern boundary until the numbers made sense. Grandpa's fence was not on the property line. It sat 3 feet inside our land. Marlene had spent weeks photographing it, touching it, talking about it as if it marked the edge between us. But there was a strip of Mercer land beyond it that no one had thought about in 40 years. I walked outside with a tape measure and checked it twice, because that was how Grandpa taught me. 3 feet, almost exactly, running the full length of the pasture. I stood there in the late afternoon light, one boot on each side of the old fence, and felt something inside me settle. I was done reacting. The following week brought 3 more complaints. First came an environmental officer investigating a report that my cedar boards were leaching chemicals into the soil, which was impressive considering they'd never been pressure treated. Then animal control showed up because someone claimed raccoons were nesting inside the structure and threatening neighborhood pets. The officer looked through the rails, saw no raccoons, then asked whether Marlene was the same woman who had reported a dangerous fox because it walked across her patio at sunrise. On Friday, the fire marshal inspected the fence for what the complaint described as extreme combustible risk. He rubbed one board with his thumb, looked at the green pasture on both sides, and said, "If this catches fire before the rest of Colorado does, I will personally buy your neighbor dinner." Every official cleared me, but every visit took time away from the quarry. And that was the point. Marlene did not need one complaint to succeed. She wanted 100 small inconveniences to wear me down. Then the neighborhood started changing. People who had waved to me for years suddenly looked busy when I passed. The Barretts complained about my loader starting before 7. The Coopers asked whether quarry dust could damage their solar panels. Someone posted a blurry photograph of one of my stone saws in a neighborhood Facebook group with the caption "Industrial activity creeping into residential areas." The funny part was that the quarry had been there before every residential house in the group, but facts do not travel as fast as fear. Marlene had created the page herself and named it Bellwether Community Preservation. Her profile picture showed her standing beside a mountain overlook with the words "Protect what we love" written across the sky. I watched one of her videos late one night. Sitting alone in my kitchen with the volume low, she walked along her patio describing noise pollution, visual blight, and the danger of allowing outdated commercial uses to define a modern neighborhood. Behind her, through the windows, my grandfather's fence appeared in every frame like a criminal suspect. She never said my name, which somehow made it worse. She called me a legacy landowner resistant to progress. I shut the laptop and sat there for a while, listening to the refrigerator hum. I was not proud of how much it hurt. These were people who had borrowed my tractor, attended my father's funeral, brought casseroles when he got sick. Now they were studying me like I had become an obstacle in their view. The answer arrived 2 days later in the form of a silver electric sedan and a man named Curtis Vale. He wore loafers that had never touched mud before and carried a tablet under one arm. Curtis represented Summit Arc Development, a company planning a 240-home community along the southern ridge. He complimented my land, my road access, and my mountain exposure, then offered to buy the quarry and both acres around my house for more money than I had ever seen written on one page. I asked why they needed my property. He gave me the kind of smile people use when the truthful answer is inconvenient. Your parcel provides the only practical access to the northern face. Without it, construction costs become difficult. There it was. I asked whether Marlene worked for him. His smile did not disappear, but it stopped looking natural. Mrs. Porce Voss has been helpful in communicating community concerns. Helpful how? Curtis tapped his tablet. She understands that long-term residents sometimes need encouragement to consider opportunities they might otherwise reject. Encouragement. That was the word he used for false complaints, public humiliation, and turning neighbors against me. I declined the offer. He increased it before leaving. I declined again. At the end of the driveway, he lowered his voice and said, "Mr. Mercer, development moves forward. The only question is whether people benefit from it or get left behind." I watched his car disappear down the road, then called Laura Kim, the attorney who had handled my father's estate. Laura listened without interrupting while I described the HOA letters, the inspections, the Facebook campaign, and Curtis Vale's offer. When I finished, she said, "Wade, stop speaking to either of them without recording it. This sounds less like a fence dispute and more like coordinated pressure to force a sale." She told me to save every letter, screenshot every post, and install cameras. Then she asked about the quarry zoning and whether the HOA documents contained any grandfather clauses. I had never read the full covenant. Most people do not until someone uses it against them. Ruth Ellison had, apparently. She appeared at my door the next evening with a grocery bag full of cinnamon rolls and a yellow folder thick with copied records. Ruth placed both on my table and said, "The rolls are for morale. The folder is for war." She had spent 3 days at the county clerk's office, where being 82 and charming apparently opened doors lawyers needed appointments to reach. Inside were business filings showing Marlene as the owner of Voss Community Strategies, a consulting company contracted by Summit Arc Development. Her compensation included a $20,000 bonus for every key parcel acquired in our district. There were mortgage records, too. Her beautiful farmhouse had been purchased with an adjustable loan scheduled to reset in 7 months, and public lien suggested she owed more than $40,000 on renovations. Ruth leaned back and said, "She did not move here for the mountain view. She moved here because your land is her retirement plan." The last page was a copy of the Cedar Crest Covenant, with Section 4.8 highlighted in red. All agricultural, extractive, and commercial operations existing before association formation shall remain exempt from later aesthetic or operational restrictions, including reasonable modifications necessary for continued use. I read it twice. The quarry was protected, The pasture was protected. Improvements supporting either one were protected. Marlene's fines were not merely unfair. They were meaningless. I called Denise the next morning and asked one more question. If I bought livestock and built a barrier inside the surveyed line, could the HOA stop me? She answered immediately. Not if it meets setback and safety requirements. How tall? Up to 8 feet. What material? Whatever is structurally sound. I looked to the office window at stacks of pale gray limestone cut from our own ridge, blocks dense enough to hold back earth and old enough to remember oceans. By noon, my cousin Dean was standing beside me in the quarry yard, running a gloved hand across a 6-foot slab. Dean had learned stonework from Grandpa just like I had, though he enjoyed trouble more than I did. I told him I wanted a wall 7 feet high and 180 feet long, built 3 feet beyond the cedar fence, fully inside our property. He whistled. That is not a wall, Wade. That is a geological opinion. I said, good. I wanted expressed clearly. We designed deep footings below the frost line, reinforced concrete, interlocking limestone blocks, and drainage channels that would make the structure last longer than either house. For legal purpose, I bought 4 miniature goats from a rancher named Elena Ruiz, who laughed for a full minute when I explained why I needed them. By the end of the week, survey stakes marked the line. Permits were confirmed, cameras covered every angle, and a concrete crew was scheduled for Monday morning. Marlene saw the orange flags that Saturday. She marched across the grass in white pants and sunglasses, stopping just beyond the old fence. What are you doing? She demanded. I leaned on the cedar rail Grandpa built and said, updating, like you suggested. Her face tightened. You cannot build anything here without HOA approval. I handed her a copy of the zoning confirmation. She barely looked at it. This is retaliation. No, I said, retaliation is emotional. This is agricultural infrastructure. Then one of the goats bleated from the trailer behind me, and Dean had to turn away so she would not see him laughing. Marlene stared at the livestock, then at the marked foundation line, then past me toward the limestone blocks waiting in the quarry yard. For the first time since she moved in, she looked afraid. At 11:43 that night, one of my new cameras sent an alert to my phone, and on the screen I saw a dark figure step onto my property carrying a pry bar. I was out the door before I had fully pulled on my boots, moving through the dark with my phone in one hand and a flashlight in the other. But I did not run straight toward the figure because Laura had made me promise not to do anything heroic and stupid in equal measure. I stopped behind the equipment shed, called the sheriff, and watched through the camera feed as a person bent over one of the wooden forms Dean had built for the foundation. The pry bar slid beneath the boards, then lifted hard enough to crack the frame. After that came a pair of cutters. The measuring lines snapped one by one, and finally the figure dragged a plastic container from behind the fence and poured something dark into the trench. When the flashlight beam from the first patrol vehicle swept across the pasture, the person froze, turned, and ran directly toward Marlene's back gate. She did not get far. Deputy Aaron Mills caught her beside a row of ornamental shrubs, still wearing black gloves and carrying the cutters. The container held used motor oil. Marlene tried to explain that she had seen suspicious activity and entered my property to investigate it, which might have sounded more convincing if the suspicious activity had not been her destroying my construction forms on 3 separate cameras. The damage cost me nearly $1,000 and delayed the concrete pour by 2 days. But when I watched the footage again the next morning, I felt less angry than sad. She had convinced herself that my refusal to surrender was an attack on her. And once people start believing they are the victim of someone else's boundaries, they can justify almost anything. Curtis Vale arrived that afternoon, this time with another man in a navy suit and no trace of his earlier friendliness. They stood beside the broken forms while Dean repaired them, and Curtis offered me twice the original purchase price if I stopped construction and signed before the end of the month. I asked whether the offer included payment for the damage caused by his consultant. His jaw tightened. Marlene acted independently. I held up my phone and said, "That is interesting, because I have messages showing she sent photographs of this site to your office 10 minutes before she came onto my property." The man beside him looked at Curtis, and Curtis looked at me with the expression of someone realizing the quiet man he had underestimated had been keeping receipts. Then his voice dropped. "Development projects create pressure, Wade. Roads change, services change, neighborhoods change. People who cooperate usually do well. People who resist often find the process uncomfortable. Dean stopped hammering. Two concrete workers looked up. I asked, distantly, "Are you threatening me in front of witnesses?" Curtis glanced around, recovered his smile, and called it a misunderstanding, but the conversation was already recorded. Laura nearly laughed when I sent it to her. She filed for a protective order, added Summit Arc to the harassment claim, and forwarded the evidence to the county prosecutor. Marlene responded by filing a police report claiming I had cornered her at the fence and threatened physical harm. That story lasted about 4 hours. My quarry time card showed I had been supervising a delivery 12 miles away. 6 employees confirmed it, and the cameras showed no contact between us. Filing false reports did not make her look frightened. It made her look desperate. Then she called the television station. A reporter named Tessa Grant arrived expecting a story about a vindictive quarry owner building a revenge wall to punish an innocent retiree. Marlene had supplied photographs, neighborhood complaints, and a carefully edited video in which my machinery sounded like an airport runway. I invited Tess into the office, handed her the original survey, the agricultural zoning letter, the grandfather clause, the cleared inspection reports, the contract connecting Marlene to Summit Arc, and the footage of the nighttime sabotage. Her questions changed immediately. By sunset, the story was no longer about my wall. It was about a developer using a paid neighborhood activist to pressure long-term landowners into selling. Construction began at sunrise the next Monday. Concrete trucks rolled in first, then flatbeds carrying limestone blocks so large the road seemed to tremble beneath them. A crane lifted each piece over the old cedar fence and lowered it onto the cured foundation with slow, deliberate precision. The first block landed with a deep thud I felt in my boots. Marlene stood behind her kitchen windows, watching the mountain disappear one section at a time. I did not wave. I did not smile. Some moments are too serious for gloating. By the 4th day, the wall stood 7 feet high and 180 feet long. Pale gray stone fitted so tightly that a knife blade could not slide between the joints. The cedar fence remained untouched on my side, silver and slightly leaning, exactly as Grandpa had left it. The goats arrived that afternoon. 4 ridiculous little animals with floppy ears, loud opinions, and no respect for dramatic timing. One climbed onto a stack of hay while another stole Dean's glove and ran through the pasture with 6 neighborhood children chasing behind it. That was the moment Marlene lost the rest of the community. It is difficult to convince people they are witnessing industrial oppression while their children are laughing and feeding apple slices to miniature goats. The HOA meeting that month drew nearly every household in Cedar Crest. Carl Danner opened with an apology for issuing violations without reviewing the property's protected status. Then Ruth walked to the front carrying her yellow folder like she had been waiting her whole life for that hallway. Laura presented the consulting contract, the false complaints, the sabotage footage, and Curtis's recorded warning. Neighbors who have repeated Marlene's claims sat in stunned silence. The Barretts apologized publicly. The Coopers admitted they had never seen evidence of quarry dust on their solar panels. When Marlene finally stood, she said she had only been trying to protect property values. But Ruth answered from the second row, "No, honey. You were trying to protect your commission." The vote to remove Marlene from the board was 44-2. Summit Arc canceled its acquisition plan within 6 weeks after county investigators began reviewing similar complaints against other landowners. Marlene's criminal case ended with probation, restitution, and a permanent order keeping her off my property. Her house went into foreclosure before winter after the mortgage reset. In one cold morning, I watched the pearl-colored SUV pull away for the last time. I expected satisfaction, but what I felt was relief, quiet and heavy, like setting down a stone I had carried too far. The new family next door introduced themselves with cookies and 2 children who immediately asked whether the goats had names. They never complained about the wall. They said it made the yard feel private. These days, sunlight hits the limestone every morning and turns it almost gold. While behind it, my grandfather's cedar fence still stands, protected from weather, developers, and anyone who mistakes age for weakness. I used to think winning meant proving the other person wrong. Now I think it means preserving what they tried to make you abandon without becoming as cruel as they were. Still, some people say the wall was too much, that I could have stopped after exposing Marlene and spared her view. Maybe they are right. Or maybe a boundary is meaningless if the person crossing it never faces anything permanent. Tell me what you would have done. Would you have built the wall, taken the money, or fought only in court. And if an HOA has ever tried to erase something your family built, share your story and your state in the comments. Because sometimes justice comes from a judge, and sometimes it arrives on a flatbed truck weighing 12 tons.